I remember that day clearly. The road ahead of me stretched into a blur of heat and dust, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I had taken a detour from my usual route, just to clear my head. Nothing unusual at first, just a few hours of driving through the middle of nowhere. The engine of my old car hummed steadily, and the air smelled of dry earth. My phone had lost service miles ago, and with each passing mile, it felt like I was sinking deeper into a void. There were no other cars, no signs of civilization, just barren fields and long stretches of gravel road. I thought I'd take a scenic route, but now I was beginning to wonder if it had been a mistake. The road was narrow, winding in strange angles, and I couldn't remember the last time I had passed another person. My only companions were the occasional crows perched on the dead trees that lined the edge of the road, their black eyes seeming to follow my every move. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, but a nagging unease settled in my chest, pulling at me like a weight I couldn't shake. Around midday, the heat started to get unbearable. My car's air conditioner sputtered and died hours ago. Sweat rolled down my back as I wiped my forehead with the back of my hand. I had no choice but to keep going, though. Turning around seemed like too much of a hassle. Besides, how much further could it be? A sign finally appeared, rusted and half-hidden by the overgrowth. It read Warren's Hollow, 10 miles. The name did nothing to calm my nerves. In fact, it made me more uneasy. I couldn't place it, but there was something strange about that name, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I passed a dilapidated barn, its wooden planks sagging under years of neglect. The trees here seemed to grow in twisted, unnatural patterns, their branches reaching out like long, gnarled fingers. The air felt thick, as though the very atmosphere itself was weighing me down. As I turned another bend, I saw something up ahead. At first, it seemed like a mirage, an illusion created by the heat. But as I got closer, the image became clearer. A small, run-down gas station sat on the side of the road. It looked like it hadn't been in business for years. The paint was peeling from the walls, and the pump was rusted, the nozzle hanging limply like it hadn't been touched in decades. I pulled in, needing to stretch my legs and grab some water. It was the first sign of civilization I had seen in what felt like forever. The building was silent, almost too silent, as though it hadn't heard the sound of human footsteps in ages. A small, rickety door led into the station's office, and I pushed it open with a creak that echoed in the stillness. Inside, the air smelled stale and musty. The shelves were lined with dusty, expired snacks and old newspapers. There were no signs of life, no cashier, no customers. Just empty space and the faint hum of an old refrigerator in the back. I walked around, unsure of what to do. There was a counter with a register, but it looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. My footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor as I made my way to the back, hoping to find a bathroom or maybe some bottled water. That's when I noticed something strange. On one of the shelves, behind a stack of old magazines, was a small, weathered book. It was a thick, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Something about it drew me in. I hesitated for a moment before reaching out to grab it. The moment my fingers touched the cover, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was an odd sensation, like the book wasn't just a book, like it was waiting for me to find it. I opened the journal, and the first page was filled with what seemed to be hastily scribbled notes. The handwriting was barely legible, but the words stood out against the fading ink. They never leave. No one ever leaves, I frowned and turned the page. It was more of the same. Fragmented sentences, disjointed thoughts, as though the writer had been desperately trying to get something off their chest. A chill ran through me as I read on. It's in the land, the earth here. It doesn't let go. The pages became more erratic, as though the writer was growing increasingly agitated. My heart began to race. I flipped through the book quickly now, scanning the pages in search of something more, but everything seemed to blur together. Words about the land, about people disappearing, about something watching. I couldn't make sense of it, but I felt my skin prickling with an unease that I couldn't explain. I didn't want to stay there any longer. The atmosphere of the gas station was starting to feel oppressive, like something was watching me from the corners of the room. I stuffed the journal into my backpack, not sure why I felt compelled to take it with me, but I did. Without thinking, I left the gas station and headed back to my car. As I drove away, the feeling of being followed crept over me, settling in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching me from behind, from the edges of the trees, from the long stretch of empty road. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, and I forced myself to focus on the road ahead. It was then that I saw it, a figure in the distance standing on the side of the road. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield. It was a man, dressed in ragged clothes, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He was holding something in his hands, but I couldn't tell what it was. I should have driven past. I should have kept going. But for some reason, I didn't. I stopped the car a few feet away from him, my engine idling. The man didn't move. I honked the horn, but he didn't react. I felt my pulse quicken, and I was just about to roll the window down and ask if he needed help when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was something off about the way he stood. It was as if he wasn't fully there, like his figure was fading in and out of focus, flickering like a bad TV signal. My hand shot to the door handle, ready to speed off, but before I could move, the man turned his head slowly, very slowly. I couldn't see his face. It was covered by the shadow of his hat, but something about his movement was unnatural, like it wasn't human. I floored the gas pedal without thinking. The car shot forward, and I didn't look back until I reached the main road, miles down the way. The rest of the drive was a blur, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had just seen. But soon, I reached a sign for a town called Warren's Hollow, the very place I'd seen on the sign earlier. The feeling of unease was still gnawing at me, but I was too tired to keep going. I decided to stop for the night. The town was small, barely more than a handful of buildings. A motel sat on the corner, its neon lights flickering weakly. I parked the car, grabbed my backpack, and made my way inside. The lobby smelled of old carpet and stale coffee. The receptionist, an elderly woman with frail hands, smiled at me as I approached. Her eyes were dull, but she greeted me with a friendly enough tone, giving me the key to a room without a word. It wasn't until I stepped into the room that I felt the weight of the silence settle around me. It wasn't a loud silence. It wasn't a ghostly silence. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the world outside had just stopped. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind still reeling from the events of the day. Something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt like I was being drawn into something far bigger than I could comprehend. I pulled out the journal from my backpack and started flipping through it again. As I reached the final pages, one line stood out to me, clearer than the rest. The land calls to you. It won't let you go. You can't leave once you're here. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The walls of the room seemed to close in around me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was in the room with me, something that had been there all along. It wasn't until the next morning that I understood. I left the motel, hoping to get out of town as quickly as possible. But as I drove out, I realized something horrifying. The road I had driven in on, the road that had led me to Warren's Hollow, was gone. The familiar landmarks, the signs, the gas station, everything was gone. All that remained was an empty stretch of road leading further into the wilderness. I was trapped. It was supposed to be a quick trip, a weekend getaway, nothing extravagant, just a few days of hiking through the woods to disconnect and clear my mind. I had booked a cabin in a remote part of the mountains, far from the city noise and constant distractions. The kind of place where you could forget everything and just listen to the silence. At least that's how I thought it would be. The cabin itself was quaint, rustic even. It had a log cabin charm, with wood beams across the ceiling and a stone fireplace that crackled with warmth as I unpacked my things. I arrived in the afternoon, just as the last of the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. It looked peaceful, serene, perfect place to recharge. The first evening was fine. I sat on the porch with a beer, watching the sky turn from gold to a deep purple as the sun set behind the peaks. I could hear the wind rustling through the trees, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the distant call of a bird. But other than that, it was quiet, dead quiet, the kind of quiet that feels strange at first, like the whole world is holding its breath. That night, I went inside early, wanting to get a good rest for the hike I had planned the next day. I curled up on the couch, the crackling of the fire my only company. The sounds of the woods outside were muffled by the thick walls of the cabin. At some point, I drifted off to sleep. The next day, I woke up early, eager to explore the trail I'd heard about from the owner of the cabin. It was a well-known route, one that cut through dense forest and offered views from the ridgelines. I packed my gear, water, snacks, and a map, just in case, and headed out. The hike was challenging but beautiful. The trail was narrow, winding through thick clusters of trees and over streams that gurgled quietly in the background. I was making good progress, taking my time to enjoy the scenery. The air was crisp, the scent of pine and earth filling my lungs with each step. I walked for hours, only stopping once to eat a granola bar by a small creek. I was beginning to feel the weight of the hike when I noticed the sun starting to dip lower in the sky. The shadows were getting longer, and I knew I needed to start heading back. The last thing I wanted was to be caught in the woods after dark, especially in an area so remote. The owner of the cabin had warned me about getting lost, and though I hadn't seen anything too alarming, there was something about the isolation that began to gnaw at me. It wasn't until I started retracing my steps that I realized something was wrong. At first, it was subtle. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I felt off, like someone was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was overtired from the hike, but the sensation only grew stronger. The trail seemed different now, unfamiliar somehow. I'd been so sure of my direction earlier, but now everything looked the same. The trees blurred together in a sea of green, and the path beneath my boots seemed to twist and change with every step. I checked my map, but it didn't help much. The landmarks I had passed earlier were nowhere to be seen. Had I taken a wrong turn? The unease settled into my stomach like a rock. I stopped and listened. The wind had died down, and there were no sounds except the occasional bird call and the rustle of leaves. But there was something else, something faint, almost imperceptible. A crackling sound, like footsteps. I held my breath, straining my ears to catch any movement. Nothing, just the stillness. I decided to keep moving, my steps faster now, as if trying to outrun the sense of dread creeping up behind me. The sun was getting lower, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were closing in around me, blocking out the light. By the time I realized I was truly lost, it was already too late. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't on the right path. I had no idea where I was. Panic surged through me. I tried retracing my steps, but every direction seemed to lead deeper into the woods. The trees towered overhead, casting long, dark shadows that made it harder to find any familiar landmarks. My heart raced as the sinking feeling in my chest grew heavier. I had read enough survival stories to know that getting lost in the wilderness was no joke. I had to find my way back before nightfall, or I might end up in real trouble. I tried to stay calm, taking deep breaths as I scanned the area for any sign of the trail. But it was useless. The more I searched, the more disoriented I became. The landscape felt like it was shifting, the ground uneven beneath my feet. The path I had once followed now seemed like a distant memory, and I couldn't remember which direction I'd come from. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, there wouldn't be. I had known that when I planned the trip. The cabin was isolated, and the cell towers were miles away. I had been relying on the map I'd been given, but now that map seemed worthless. My eyes scanned the surroundings desperately, looking for any sign of life, any hint of civilization. But there was nothing, just trees and silence. The heavy kind of silence that makes you feel small and insignificant. The sky was growing darker, the sun now a sliver on the horizon. The panic in my chest turned to dread. I was still out there, and night was coming. I don't know how long I wandered through the woods after that. Time became irrelevant. I just kept moving, hoping for something, but everything felt wrong. I had no idea where I was anymore. No idea how to get back. Every noise made me jump. Every rustle of leaves sent a spike of terror through me. My mind was racing, imagining the worst. And then I saw it, a shape in the distance, just past a cluster of trees, barely visible in the fading light. At first, I thought it was a trick of the mind, a shadow. But as I got closer, I could see it more clearly. A figure, a man. I froze. He was standing still, just watching me. He didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel his eyes on me, like he was studying me. My blood ran cold. I had no idea who he was, and he wasn't supposed to be out here. No one was supposed to be out here, not this deep in the woods, not this far from any trail. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my breath shallow and quick. After what felt like an eternity, the figure finally turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees as if he had never been there at all. I stood there, heart pounding, too terrified to move. My thoughts raced. Was he following me? Was I in danger? I didn't wait around to find out. I turned and ran. I ran blindly through the woods, dodging trees and rocks, not caring about where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away from that man. I didn't know if he was a threat, but I couldn't risk finding out. The darkness of the forest seemed to close in around me, the air thick with tension. The ground was uneven, and my legs were starting to give out, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. Every step felt like I was racing against something unseen, something that could be right behind me. And then, finally, I saw it. The cabin. The lights were on, just visible through the trees. My heart leapt with relief. I wasn't lost anymore. I wasn't alone. I stumbled toward it, my breath ragged, every muscle in my body screaming for rest. As I reached the porch, I collapsed against the railing, gasping for air. I didn't care if I looked like a mess. I had made it back, safe. I went inside, locked the door behind me, and didn't leave again that night. I didn't even want to go out for the rest of the weekend. The next morning, I packed my bags and left as soon as I could. I never saw the man again, and when I told the owner of the cabin what had happened, he didn't seem surprised. He just nodded like he had heard it before. "I've heard stories about that place," he said. "People get lost in these woods all the time. Some never come back. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I don't plan on finding out. That trip was supposed to be an escape, a chance to clear my head. But it taught me one thing: the wilderness doesn't give you a second chance. You're just another part of the landscape, a speck in the vastness of nature. And sometimes nature doesn't want you there." I was on the road for hours, just me and the hum of the engine. The last stretch was going to take me deeper into nowhere, or at least that's how it felt. My GPS lost signal about 30 minutes ago, which wasn't exactly reassuring, but I wasn't too worried. I'd been in tight spots before, mostly small towns with cracked roads and faded street signs, but I'd always made it out just fine. It was late afternoon, and the sun hung low in the sky, a weak orange glow stretching across the landscape. Nothing but empty fields, the occasional barn, and stretches of overgrown bushes on either side of the road. The trees started getting denser the further I drove, their branches hanging like dark fingers against the sky. The roads became narrower, winding more than I remembered from the maps I'd glanced at before leaving the last town. The smell of fresh earth and damp leaves crept through my slightly cracked window. I checked my phone. No signal. The thing is, I wasn't exactly lost, at least not yet. I had a destination, or I thought I did. There was a place called Jackson's Hollow, a small, forgotten town nestled in the middle of nowhere. I had never been there, but a job came up that needed me to go. Simple enough. I'd find the place, check out what they needed, and then head back to the city. That was the plan. The further I went, though, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't the usual kind of unease. There was something off about this whole place, like the world was a little too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind where you start to feel like you're being watched, even when you're completely alone. The trees pressed in closer. The road barely felt like a road anymore. It was more like a dirt path that hadn't been maintained in years. I slowed down. I didn't want to risk hitting something and getting stuck. The thought of walking out here for help in this wilderness wasn't something I relished. The sun was almost gone now, and the sky was deepening into a shadowy blue. I checked my watch. 7:45 p.m. No sign of Jackson's Hollow yet. I knew I had been driving for a while, but I thought I should have seen something by now, even a faint hint of lights or buildings in the distance. I rounded a sharp bend and saw it. A small, worn-down sign with the word Jackson's Hollow, painted in chipped, fading white letters. It was hanging by a single nail, swaying slightly in the wind. It was barely visible in the dim light, and I almost missed it. This was it, the town I had been searching for. But as I drove past, I felt a sense of relief, mixed with confusion. Where was everyone? The place looked deserted. The buildings, if you could even call them that, were crumbling, some with broken windows, others with collapsed roofs. The streetlights were either flickering or completely out. The road wasn't even paved here. It was just cracked concrete with patches of dirt. There were no cars, no people walking around. Nothing. I drove slowly through the town, my headlights bouncing off the dilapidated structures. I could make out the old church at the end of the road. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. I felt the chill creeping into my bones, even with the windows up. This wasn't a normal town. There was something wrong with it, but I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. I parked in front of a small house. The place looked like it had been abandoned a long time ago, but I saw movement inside. It wasn't much, just a slight shift of the curtain. I decided to go up and knock. The house didn't look welcoming, but I figured I'd at least try to find someone who could tell me what was going on here. My hand hovered over the doorbell, but something made me pause. I didn't know what it was. Maybe it was the way the house was too still, or the fact that I had been driving for so long and hadn't seen anyone else. But I pressed the doorbell anyway, a harsh, buzzing sound breaking the silence. Nothing. I waited for a moment, staring at the door, but still no response. My instincts were telling me to leave, but I ignored them, turning and walking around the side of the house. There was a shed in the back, barely visible through the overgrown weeds. I didn't expect to find anything useful, but something made me walk toward it. As I reached the shed, I noticed something strange. A faint sound, like the scraping of metal against wood, echoed in the air. It didn't sound like an animal, more like someone or something moving inside. I approached the door cautiously, my hand brushing the peeling wood as I slowly pushed it open. The inside of the shed was dark, filled with dusty old tools and boxes. But in the far corner, I saw something that made my heart race. A figure. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but it was too still, too perfectly shaped. I stepped forward, squinting in the dim light, but before I could make out any details, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door slamming shut behind me. I whipped around, heart pounding. The door was now firmly closed, and the feeling of being trapped began to crawl over me. I tried to yank it open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic rose in my chest as I realized I wasn't alone. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Couldn't just freak out, not yet. I had to stay calm, think clearly. I turned back to the shed. The figure was still there, unmoving. My mind raced. Should I go back to the house? Should I try to find another way out? I didn't have many options. I took another step toward the figure in the corner. This time I wasn't afraid. Or maybe I was, but I wasn't going to let it show. As I got closer, I saw that it wasn't a person at all. It was just an old mannequin, its clothes ragged, its face obscured by layers of dirt. It had been propped up against the wall, as if someone had placed it there a long time ago and forgot about it. I exhaled in relief, my heart rate slowing down. It was just a stupid mannequin. But as I turned to leave the shed, something caught my eye. On the ground near the door, partially hidden under a pile of old newspapers, was a small notebook. I bent down, pulling it out. It was leather-bound, old, its pages yellowed with age. I flipped it open, skimming through the entries. They were all written in a hurried, messy hand, as if someone had been desperate to get their thoughts down. "Don't trust them," one entry read. "They'll make you believe you're safe, but you're never safe." I turned the page. "The things they hide are worse than you think. Don't go to the church." My throat went dry as I read the words. What the hell was this? Who wrote this? And why was it hidden here? Suddenly, I heard something again. The door. It was rattling now, like someone was on the other side, trying to get in. I stood frozen, the notebook still in my hands. It wasn't a person. This wasn't someone playing a prank. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. Whatever was on the other side of that door was not human. With one final glance at the notebook, I tucked it into my jacket, bolted for the door, and shoved it open with all my strength. The moment I stepped outside, I saw it. Someone standing at the end of the yard, their silhouette barely visible in the fading light. I didn't think. I just ran. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just a short drive to get away from the noise, the constant buzz of the city, the stress of work. I found the cabin online. The listing said it was remote, nestled deep in the woods with no neighbors for miles. The pictures were beautiful, just the kind of place I thought I could relax and clear my head. A cozy log cabin surrounded by dense trees, a small lake nearby, and a sense of isolation that I thought would be refreshing. It seemed perfect for what I needed. The drive there took longer than I expected. The GPS kept cutting out as I got deeper into the woods, and the road became less of a road and more of a dirt path. The trees were thick, their trunks so close together that it felt like I was driving through a green tunnel. I hadn't seen another car in hours. The air smelled different here, fresher, but also damp, like the earth had been soaked for days. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I felt like something was watching me, but I brushed it off. My mind was just playing tricks. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like in the pictures. Rustic, charming, with a small porch that overlooked the lake. It was the kind of place that felt like it was stuck in time. I could hear the soft chirping of crickets, the rustling of the trees, and the occasional splash of a fish in the lake. Everything felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. I unpacked my car and brought in my things. It wasn't long before I had the fire going inside and the cabin felt warm. I could hear the crackle of the wood as the flames danced. I made myself a cup of tea and settled into one of the armchairs by the window, watching the sun begin to set over the water. It looked like the kind of sunset you only see in pictures, pink and orange streaks across the sky. For a moment, I thought maybe this weekend would be just what I needed. As night fell, the air grew colder. The only sounds were the fire in the hearth and the occasional gust of wind outside. I wrapped myself in a blanket and turned off the lights, letting the fire provide the only glow in the room. I could hear the wind howling through the trees now, a constant low moan that seemed to shake the walls. It didn't bother me at first, but as the hours wore on, it started to get to me. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. The bed was comfortable, the sheets cool against my skin. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The wind outside was louder now, and every now and then I thought I heard something scratching at the walls, just soft enough that it could have been the trees rubbing against the cabin. Still, the sound made me uneasy. I tried to ignore it, closing my eyes and taking deep breaths. I was in the middle of nowhere, and there was no reason to be scared. Yet, the sense of isolation felt heavier now. The idea that there was nothing around for miles. The nearest town was an hour away, the nearest person even further. It was quiet here, too quiet. It made me feel exposed, like I was too far from safety. Eventually, I fell asleep, but it didn't last long. The sound of something scraping at the window woke me. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, but then I heard it, sharp, deliberate, like fingernails on glass. My heart started pounding as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. It was hard to tell where the sound was coming from, but it felt close, too close. I got out of bed and crept to the window, my pulse racing in the silence. Outside, the trees were dark shadows, the night swallowing up everything beyond the porch. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the lake shimmered faintly, reflecting the little light that made it through. But there was nothing there. I told myself it was just an animal, a raccoon or some other small creature, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to lock the windows and double-check the doors, just to be sure. When I did, I noticed something strange. There was dirt on the doorknob, like someone had been standing there, pressing against it, but I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't heard any footsteps. My mind raced. Maybe it was just a mistake. Maybe I was being paranoid, but I couldn't ignore the feeling creeping up my spine. I went back to bed but couldn't sleep. The noise outside had stopped, but now I couldn't stop thinking about it. I lay there in the dark, listening to the wind, trying to calm my thoughts. But every time I closed my eyes, the image of that dirt on the doorknob kept coming back. In the morning, I went outside to clear my head. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky with shades of gold and pink. The lake looked peaceful, and the trees were still. But as I walked around the cabin, I noticed something odd. There were fresh footprints in the mud leading up to the porch. They weren't there the night before, I was sure of it. The prints were deep, like someone had been walking around the cabin for hours, pacing back and forth. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't just that there were footprints, it was the fact that they were fresh. No one had passed by here in days. I hadn't seen anyone, I hadn't heard anyone. And yet here they were, large, heavy prints in the soft mud. I backed away from the porch and stood still, trying to think. My phone had no signal, of course. The cabin was supposed to be off the grid, but that meant I was completely isolated. I didn't want to panic, but the evidence was there. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching me. For the next couple of hours, I tried to convince myself I was just overreacting. Maybe it was just some hikers or campers who had passed through. Maybe they had stayed the night, not realizing the cabin was occupied. But the more I thought about it, the less likely that seemed. The prints weren't from a casual walk. They were deliberate, heavy. They didn't look like someone passing through. They looked like someone who had been waiting. By mid-afternoon, I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. The thought of being alone in that cabin, with the strange noises and the footprints, was too much. I packed up my things quickly, more hastily than I would have liked. The whole time, I felt like someone was just outside the window, watching, waiting. The cabin felt suffocating now, like it had turned against me. I was halfway to my car when I heard it again, the soft scratching at the window. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I turned slowly, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. The window was shut tight, the glass still. I quickly jumped into my car, locked the doors, and started the engine, desperate to leave. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights following me, or worse, someone walking behind me in the woods. But there was nothing, just the winding road, the trees, and the empty miles stretching ahead. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway, where I finally felt some relief. The city seemed so far away, but the sense of safety that came with it was undeniable. As I drove home, I kept replaying the events in my mind, wondering if I had imagined it all. But the footprints, the noise, the strange feeling of being watched, it was real. I never went back to that cabin, but I've often wondered, especially on quiet nights when I'm alone, if someone was truly out there, waiting for me, or if it was something else entirely, something that the woods had claimed long before I ever arrived. It was the kind of day you'd never remember unless something went wrong. The kind of day that's just background noise to life, where the sky is a dull gray and the air hangs heavy with the scent of earth. The kind of day that makes you feel small, almost insignificant, surrounded by the vastness of the world. I had been driving for hours, alone, through roads that seemed to stretch on forever, through nothing but trees and the occasional farmhouse. The radio had long since lost its signal, and the only sound left was the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the tires on the uneven asphalt. It was one of those rare moments where everything felt empty. No distractions, no people, just me and the road. I had taken the wrong turn somewhere. Maybe it was the third turn I made when I thought the GPS was telling me to go right, but actually, it wanted me to go left. Or maybe I was just too tired to care. Either way, the map had stopped helping long ago. The little red dot on the screen kept moving ahead of me, teasing me like it knew something I didn't. I wasn't lost. At least I didn't think I was, but I definitely wasn't where I'd planned to be. The trees had become thicker, the houses fewer. Now it was just a long stretch of road with nothing but forest on either side. The sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long shadows across the pavement, and the temperature was dropping. I had no idea what time it was. I hadn't bothered checking the clock in hours. That's when I saw the sign. It was rusted, the paint peeling, but it was still legible enough. A simple wooden post with a faded white board, reading, "Welcome to Brookhaven." I didn't even know what a Brookhaven was. It didn't matter. It wasn't much of a town, if it was even a town. But it was somewhere, and I had been driving so long, I just wanted to stop. The road into the town, if you could even call it that, was narrow, twisting, and overgrown. The trees formed a canopy above, blocking out the last of the sun's light, leaving the road in near darkness. The faint glow of street lamps began to flicker on as I crept further in. The houses were spaced far apart, isolated, with yards that were nothing more than patches of dirt and a few scattered, sad-looking trees. There was a gas station on the right, one of those old, run-down places that looks like it hasn't seen a customer in years. But the lights were on, and there was a car parked under the awning. I pulled into the lot, figuring I'd at least ask someone for directions. The man at the counter looked about as out of place as the gas station itself. He was middle-aged, maybe in his late 40s, with a grizzled beard and a flannel shirt that was far too thick for the weather. He didn't say anything when I walked in, just nodded, like he'd been waiting for me. I wasn't sure how to start the conversation, so I just asked, "Which way to the nearest highway?" He didn't answer right away, just scratched his chin, glancing out the window as if he was thinking hard about something. After a long, uncomfortable silence, he said, "Highway's a few miles out, but I'd suggest you get some rest before you keep going." I gave a nervous laugh. "I'm fine, just need to get back on track." He finally looked at me, his eyes narrow, almost too calm. "You sure about that? Out here, you never really know what's ahead. Could be safer if you wait till morning." I don't know why, but something in the way he said it set me on edge. I didn't want to stay here longer than I had to, so I just nodded. "I'll be fine." He shrugged, then pointed toward the door. "Well, if you're sure, there's a diner a few blocks down. Might help you feel better. Just be careful." I couldn't put my finger on it, but the way he said that last part felt wrong, like a warning he wasn't willing to explain. I left the gas station, trying not to let my mind wander. The diner was easy enough to find, tucked in between two decaying buildings. It was small, with a flickering neon sign that buzzed in the otherwise silent night. The windows were fogged, and the lights inside were dim, but there were a couple of cars in the lot. It didn't seem like the best place to stop, but there wasn't much choice. Inside, it smelled like old coffee and something else I couldn't quite place. There were two other people in there, sitting at a booth in the back corner, but they didn't look up when I walked in. The waitress, a young woman in a faded apron, glanced over as I entered but didn't greet me. Instead, she just pointed to an empty booth and walked away without a word. I sat down, pulling out my phone to check the time, but of course, there was no service. Typical. The woman came over after a while, her eyes heavy with something that felt like tiredness or resignation. "What'll it be?" she asked, flatly, her voice just barely audible. I ordered something simple, a burger and fries, hoping to make this stop quick. She scribbled something on her pad and turned away without another word. The diner felt off. The two people sitting in the back didn't talk, just ate in complete silence. The ticking of an old clock on the wall was the loudest sound in the room, and I started to feel like I was intruding, like I didn't belong here. After a few minutes, the woman brought over my food, sliding the plate onto the table without a word. I thanked her, though it felt strange, like she wasn't really listening. I took a bite of the burger, but it tasted like cardboard. I couldn't focus on it. My thoughts were back on the man at the gas station and the way he had spoken to me, the way everyone here seemed to avoid looking directly at me. I ate as quickly as I could, hoping I could just finish and leave. But something outside caught my eye, a figure moving through the shadows just beyond the diner's windows. It was too quick to be human, and for a second, I thought I saw it dart into the woods across the road. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't help but stare at the dark, empty street, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It was just a flash. I convinced myself it was nothing, but there was something in the air, something cold, something that didn't belong. I paid my bill, leaving a tip despite everything in me telling me not to. As I stepped back into the night, the cold hit me hard, the quiet swallowing up everything. The car was parked where I had left it, but I noticed something strange. The headlights were on. I was sure I had turned them off when I parked. I didn't stop to think about it. I just got in, slammed the door, and started the engine, ready to leave this place behind. But as I pulled away, I glanced into the rearview mirror. The diner was still there, but now the lights were off. All of them. It wasn't the usual flickering of a faulty bulb. No, it was as if they had been switched off, all at once. I pressed down on the gas pedal, trying to shake the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. The road out of town felt longer somehow. The trees seemed to close in on me as I drove, the darkness thickening. My headlights barely cut through it. And then, in the distance, I saw something, a figure standing by the side of the road. It was tall, thin, no detail, just a dark shape. I didn't stop. I couldn't make myself do it. As I sped past, I saw something strange, a flash of white, like a cloth, hanging from one of the trees. I couldn't stop staring at it, even as the figure disappeared into the woods behind me. The feeling didn't leave me, that nagging sense of wrongness. But I had to keep going. I had to get out of there. I didn't care how I got home. I just needed to leave that place behind. I wasn't sure when, but eventually I found the highway again. The trees thinned out, and the road became wider, safer. I breathed easier. I didn't look back. By the time I made it back to civilization, the weirdness of Brookhaven felt like a dream. The town, if you could even call it that, was just some random stop on the map. I told myself it didn't matter. It was nothing, but I knew better than to ignore the way my skin crawled when I thought about it. I never thought a weekend away in the middle of nowhere could feel so wrong. When we booked the cabin, I imagined long hikes, campfires, and the kind of quiet that helps you forget the noise of city life. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly the isolation would start to crawl under my skin, turning every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, into something sinister. The drive up had been fine, mostly uneventful. A few winding roads, a lot of trees, and then the cabin itself, small but cozy, tucked away on the edge of a forest. The kind of place you'd expect to find if you went looking for some peace. The kind of place people talk about when they want to get away from it all. It was just me, my partner Sarah, and our dog Max. He's a golden retriever, friendly and playful. But there was something about the place that made him nervous from the start. He wouldn't leave the porch on the first night, just stood there, staring out into the woods. Every now and then, I'd catch him looking over his shoulder, like he was waiting for something to happen. But we didn't pay it much attention then. We laughed it off. Maybe it was just the unfamiliar smells. We settled in and unpacked, but the quiet felt off. There was no hum of electricity, no distant voices, nothing but the sound of leaves rustling and an occasional bird call. After dinner, we went to bed early, trying to make the most of the fresh air. The bed in the cabin was firm, but I fell asleep quickly, grateful for the break from the usual grind. But I didn't sleep for long. I woke up in the middle of the night, my senses alert for no reason at all. At first, I thought it was just the quiet, too much of it pressing in. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound, like something clawing at the walls. I lay there, frozen, straining my ears to listen. It wasn't a branch or an animal. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I tried to wake Sarah, but she was dead asleep, her breathing slow and even. Max was at the foot of the bed, his body tense, his head turned toward the window. The scratching continued. I debated gonna check it out, but the darkness outside felt like it was swallowing the cabin whole. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I stepped into it, something would be waiting just beyond the door. So I lay there, listening, heart hammering in my chest, waiting for the sound to stop. Didn't. Eventually, it did fade away, but the silence that followed felt worse. I tried to sleep again, but my mind kept racing. What if it wasn't just the wind? What if something was out there? I kept thinking about it, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just an animal or a branch scraping against the wall. But then, at around 3 a.m., the power went out. The whole house just went dark. No warning, no flicker of lights. Max started whining, low and anxious, and I couldn't help but feel a spike of fear. I reached over to check my phone, but it had no signal. Of course, it didn't. We were in the middle of nowhere. That was when I finally decided to go outside. I couldn't stay in that room any longer, not with the air so thick with unease. I grabbed the flashlight, trying to steady my shaking hands. I whispered to Sarah, but she didn't wake up. The cold air hit me as I stepped out onto the porch, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Max was right next to me now, his leash dragging on the wooden floor. He was alert, his eyes scanning the dark trees surrounding the cabin. I turned on the flashlight, its beam slicing through the thick, inky darkness. Nothing, but the sound. It was back. Faint at first, almost as if I was imagining it, but then louder, tapping, not on the walls this time, but on the roof. I froze, staring up at the cabin's roof. The sound was unmistakable now, like something small and fast was moving across the shingles. My stomach twisted in knots. My first thought was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel, but the noise wasn't right. It was too consistent, too calculated. Max was growling low now, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to echo in the silence. I called to him, trying to calm him down, but he wouldn't stop. Then, without warning, he bolted forward, darting into the woods. "Mox!" I yelled, but he didn't listen. My heart sank as I chased after him, flashlight in hand, the beam bouncing around erratically. The woods seemed endless in every direction, the trees pressing in close, their branches whispering in the wind. I kept running, shouting for him, but there was no sign of him. The ground beneath my feet was soft, damp with dew, and I almost tripped more than once. Then I heard it, Max's bark, distant, frantic. I ran faster, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The barking stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that felt like the world was holding its breath. I reached a clearing, and that's when I saw it. Max, standing at the edge, his body low to the ground, staring into the dark. There was something there with him. At first, I thought it was a person, someone hiding in the woods. But when the flashlight hit the shape, it wasn't a person at all. It was just a large mass crouching low. It didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. My heart raced as I stood frozen, the beam of light shaking in my hand. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure, if that's even what it was, remained motionless. It felt like an eternity before I dared to take a step forward. Suddenly, Max barked again, snapping me out of my trance. That was when the shape moved. Not fast, but deliberate. It was too slow to be a predator, too unnatural to be an animal. It turned its head toward me, and I saw nothing but darkness. No eyes, no face, just the outline of something that should not have been in the woods. Then, like a switch had been flipped, Max lunged at it, barking furiously. The figure didn't flinch, didn't even react as Max got closer. The dog stopped just short of it, his fur bristling, eyes wide with terror. I called to him again, more urgently this time, and Max seemed to snap out of whatever trance he was in, turning to run back toward me. I didn't look back as I sprinted toward the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. Max followed closely behind, still barking, though it was more of a panicked whine now. I didn't stop running until I was back inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it. We stayed inside the cabin for the rest of the night, the sound of Max's rapid panting filling the silence. Couldn't sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen, or rather what I hadn't seen. The figure had been there, right in front of me, and I had no explanation for it. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal. In the morning, things were different. The sun was shining, and the woods didn't seem so dark anymore, but the tension still hung in the air. I checked the roof, and there was no sign of any animals, no marks, no evidence of anything unusual. But Max was different. He wouldn't leave the cabin. He wouldn't go outside. Took us hours to pack up and leave. We barely said a word to each other. By the time we got back to the main road, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over me, like whatever had been out there, whatever had happened, was finally behind me. But as I looked back at the cabin one last time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us from the trees. The woods were too quiet again, and in the distance, I could almost hear that faint, rhythmic scratching sound once more. I don't know what happened that night, and I don't think I ever will. All I know is that there are places out there that seem to exist outside of the normal world. Places where the rules don't apply. And when I think back to that cabin in the woods, I know one thing for certain. Some things are better left unexplored. It started with a simple, stupid decision. I didn't know it would spiral into something I'd never forget. Something that still haunts me when I'm alone at night. But back then, I thought it was just another weekend trip, nothing out of the ordinary. I'd heard about this old cabin in the woods from a friend of a friend. They said it was isolated, quiet, and perfect for a weekend getaway. No one would bother me, no distractions, just me and nature. I'd been feeling burnout from work, and the idea of being away from everything sounded like the escape I needed. The directions were vague. Head out past the old mill and take the first right after the creek. But it didn't seem hard to find. I loaded up my car with a few essentials, grabbed my camping gear, and set off on what I thought would be a peaceful weekend. The drive was longer than I expected, and the further I went, the more the trees seemed to close in on me. The road got smaller, the trees taller, and the sky darker. Eventually, the paved road gave way to gravel, and then that faded into a dirt trail that was barely wide enough for my car. I told myself it was part of the adventure. I'd been in the middle of nowhere before. I wasn't scared, but after an hour of winding through these barely there trails, the reality started to set in. There was no one else around. Not a single house or sign of civilization. Just trees, dirt roads, and the feeling of being entirely alone. The only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath my tires and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I should have turned around then. Something about that silence felt wrong, but I pushed the feeling aside. I was just being paranoid. Finally, I saw the cabin. It was small, old, and nestled in a clearing surrounded by dense woods. A thin wisp of smoke was rising from the chimney, and for a second, I felt relieved. It looked like someone had been here recently. Maybe the cabin wasn't as abandoned as I'd been led to believe. I parked the car and grabbed my stuff. The air was colder than I expected, and the quietness felt heavy, almost suffocating. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, but other than that, it was eerily still. The cabin itself was basic, wooden with peeling paint and a rusted metal roof. I unlocked the door with a key that had been left for me under the welcome mat. The inside was just as simple as the outside. An old couch, a worn-out table, and a fireplace in the corner. A few blankets were piled on a shelf, and there was a faint smell of something old and musty, but it wasn't unbearable. I set up my things, made a fire, and opened a can of soup I'd brought along. I remember feeling kind of proud of myself, thinking I was tough for being so far from civilization. Felt good to be disconnected for a while. The peace was exactly what I needed. But as night fell, that peace started to feel uncomfortable. The wind howled outside, the trees creaked, and the silence was broken by strange sounds I couldn't quite place. I tried to ignore them at first, thinking they were just the usual noises of a remote place. Branches snapping, animals rustling, the occasional creak of an old building settling. But then, I heard something that didn't feel like a normal noise. A knock came from the back of the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe an animal, but then it came again, clearer, sharper, almost like someone was knocking on the door. I froze. I'd been the only one on the road when I arrived, and there was no way anyone could have gotten here that quickly. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way cautiously to the back door. My heart was racing, but I tried to remain calm. Nothing. The wind was picking up again, and I could hear the trees outside bending with it. I stood there for a while, listening, but there was no sound. Maybe it had been my imagination, I thought. It was late and I was tired. I went back inside and locked the door behind me, but sleep didn't come easily. The strange knocking had unsettled me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept hearing footsteps outside, faint but persistent. I'd get up and look, but there was nothing there. Felt like I was being watched. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. This time, it wasn't a knock. It was a scratching sound, slow and deliberate. It was coming from the roof. I tried to convince myself it was just a branch, that the wind had blown something loose. But the longer I listened, the more certain I became that it wasn't natural. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. My mind raced through possibilities: wild animals, someone else out here, maybe a local who lived in a cabin nearby. But every explanation felt wrong. I spent the next few hours wide awake, listening to the sound, trying to figure out what was happening. The scratching continued intermittently, but it never stopped for long. It was like whoever or whatever was up there was waiting. By morning, the sound had stopped. I was exhausted both physically and mentally, but when I stepped outside, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The ground around the cabin was disturbed, like someone had been pacing in circles, leaving deep indentations in the earth. I froze. No one had been out here. No one had any reason to be. The tracks led to the front of the cabin, but then stopped as if the person, or whatever it was, had simply disappeared. I backed away slowly, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My first thought was to leave, to pack up and get out. But the thought of driving those long, winding roads back in the dark made me hesitate. I decided to stay one more night, thinking maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe it was all in my head. That night, I stayed inside, all the windows and doors locked tight. I didn't dare venture outside, but the quiet was unbearable. The wind howled, the trees creaked, and the scratching sound returned, even louder than before. At that point, I knew something was wrong. This wasn't a normal weekend getaway. I wasn't alone out here, and that's when it happened. The door suddenly slammed open, as if it had been ripped from its hinges. The force was so strong it echoed through the cabin. I jumped up, heart pounding in my chest. But when I looked, no one was there. The wind was howling, but it couldn't have caused that. I grabbed my things in a panic. There was no way I was staying here another second. I bolted for the door, but as I stepped outside, I froze. The tracks, they were back. But this time, they weren't just by the cabin, they were everywhere, leading into the woods. It was as if someone, or something, had been waiting for me to make a move. I didn't think, I just ran. I didn't care about anything else at that moment. I just needed to get out. I sprinted through the woods, heart hammering in my chest. The trees seemed to close in on me, the shadows twisting and shifting, and every snap of a twig behind me made me run faster. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I found the dirt road again. I didn't stop until I saw a car in the distance, a lone vehicle passing by. I flagged it down, and the driver, an older man with a weathered face, stopped. I didn't say much, just that I needed a ride back to the nearest town. He didn't ask questions. He just nodded, and I climbed into the passenger seat. As we drove away, I looked back at the cabin, now barely visible through the trees. I never went back to that place. I still don't know what happened there or who or what had been watching me, but whatever it was, I know it wasn't human, and I'll never make the mistake of venturing that far into the woods again.